everyone, and welcome back to The Doctor Will See You Now. Well, our session today is a session whereby the Doctor has to make a confession before we enter into our criminally delicious conversation. There's sometimes in a reader's life where you realise for so long you've been missing out. And this week for me has been one of those realizations. And it is with great pleasure then that I welcome Martin Walker into the consultation room. Hello, Martin. How are you?
Hello there, I'm fine. Good to be with you, if only electronically.
Indeed, indeed. And do you know what I would say is, if life were as it used to be, we might not have even been able to do this. So I keep looking for every silver lining possible, and
Yeah.
to have had, as I said, just now, I am so sorry that I was unaware of this fabulous, fabulous series, which ticks all the Doctor's boxes whatsoever. And I know now that I have such a beautiful back catalogue to get lost in. If I don't appear any further with these interviews, people will know that simply, I've got lost in the Dordogne thanks to your books.
Well,
So thank you.
I'm I'm glad I've got a nice tall pile of previous books in the series.
Indeed, indeed. So, for anybody who's not familiar with Martin, a prize winning journalist and an acclaimed non-fiction writer as well. But we're here, of course, as you will well know, to discuss his crime fiction writing. And this week, cause for celebration. I mean, again, viewers, if you're familiar with the Doctor Will See You Now, you know we try to bring on authors whose work is just about to be released or has just been released. And for Martin, that's book 14 in the Dordogne Mystery Series, entitled The Coldest Case. Yeah. And so to begin with, I'd like to ask you, Martin, as this is our first time together, how did you, as a journalist and a non-fiction writer, where was the moment that life took you into crime fiction?
Well, I guess there were two ways it started. It was like a 1-2. The first was that I'd been based in Moscow in the USA, in Brussels, covering Europe for The Guardian for many years. And my wife, who was also a foreign correspondent, said, we really ought to get someplace fixed for the children to have a sense of roots. And we had some friends we visited quite often here. And I was back in Washington, about to go in and see Clinton in the Oval Office, because I was at university with him, so I knew him quite well.
Mhm.
Julia and our daughters were staying with our friends in France, in the Dordogne. And I was about to go into the Oval Office, and my telephone, my mobile phone rings. Now, in those days, mobile phones were big and clunky.
Bricks.
So this great big thing, this brick rings, and it's Julia saying, I don't care what you're doing, drop everything, get the next train back to France. I have found our house. And I didn't quite know that we were actually looking for a house at this point. But I said, well, Clinton, White House interview. She said, well, as soon as you can. So
Mhm.
2 or 3 days later, I was on the plane. We met in Paris and drove down here, and she had indeed found our house, because rule number one of a happy marriage is the wife is always right.
I think, yeah, I'm very, very inclined to agree. Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, so that was the first step in it, of getting this place here. And then I became fascinated by the caves, the prehistoric cave paintings, Lascaux and so on. And I wrote my first novel about that, which was called The Caves of Perigord, which was about the people who made Lascaux, and I brought it into the present as well. And I had sort of the taste for writing this kind of book. And in my local tennis club and rugby club down here in my village, I came across a really nice guy who was like the coach for the kids for both tennis and for rugby. He was a keen hunter. He was a first-rate cook, a really nice man, and he was our village policeman. And I thought, aha! I thought, this is a great character. I want to write more about this part of the world, this Dordogne area, this Vézère Valley. But he's a policeman. That means I'm going to have to think about writing a crime story. So I wrote my first one, which was called Bruno, Chief of Police. I think they're now calling it Death in the Dordogne.
Yes.
And it was a lot about a case that goes back to the days of the French resistance, which was really important in this part of the world. And off I went. And now, once again, Julia comes into this, because when I wrote my first draft, I called the guy Pierrot, which was what we all call our local policeman. And Julia said, because she'd worked in publishing for a while, she said, two things. First of all, you want an international name. Pierrot won't work. How about something like Bruno? And then she said, now, publishers like the idea of a series when it comes to crime. So go away and write 5 short paragraphs on the plots of the 5 next stories.
Whoa.
So as always, I listened to Julia, did this, and about 3 months later, we'd been sold in America, Canada, Australia, Austria, Germany, Netherlands, and so on. We're now in 19 languages.
Yeah, fabulous, fabulous. And as you're telling your story, and I'm really grateful for you sharing this with us, it makes me think that, I think many an author would be glad of a Julia by their side, and I love the notion that often the life of a writer can be very lonely, and you're creating your characters, those narratives are coming out and you have to lock yourself away. But this sounds like crime fiction writing for you has not necessarily been such a solitary engagement.
Well, there's another aspect of Julia's role in all of this, which is the food. And next year, we're bringing out the Bruno cookbook. And it's already been a bestseller in Germany. And it won a prize as world's best French cookbook, which was a surprise for the French, I can tell you. But Julia she's a food writer. She used to write on food for the Washington Post, for United Press International, and she still writes a food column on Substack. And she is a really, really terrific cook. So everything that I write about food has got to go past Julia's eagle eye.
And if I'm right in thinking, there's a Bruno website as well, isn't there?
Oh yes, there's a Bruno Chief of Police website. There's also a fan club that some fans started in the USA called Fans of Bruno Chief of Police, which is full of stuff about the Perigord and history and so on. So social media is quite a thing.
And again, I think for myself, and I know for many viewers, the fact that the way you write is not just this solving a crime, but it's so much richer than that, with all those different elements of culture and society, and of course food and drink. That it feels like so many different senses are stimulated in that kind of reading. It's beautiful.
Well, Julia says sometimes that her one fear is that with every new novel come 2 more pounds.
Yeah, and even worse during COVID with yeah.
It's but yes, it's I mean, I'm so fascinated still by this region and by the wealth of history in it, and was just surrounded by it. If I walk out of my house here, I go in one direction, I'll come to an old rock shelter, and that's the place which is the oldest human cemetery. It's 73,000 years old. It's a place called La Ferracie, and there are 8 bodies buried there. One of them, a man in his 40s who couldn't have walked for at least 10 years because of a leg injury you can see on the bones. So this is a community that took care of him and fed him. He couldn't hunt for himself. And if I go in another direction to a lovely little hilltop village called Limeuil, the archaeologists found something extraordinary there. They found a cache of about 1,200 pieces of stone, flat stone, about the size of my 2 hands together. On each one of these was drawn one of 4 animals, either a stag or a horse, or an ox, or a dog or fox of some kind. And they were almost identical, except some of them, the leg or the tail had been crushed out and redrawn. And the only explanation we have for this is that this was the world's first art school, some 13,000 years ago, where people were learning how to engrave and draw and so on. I mean, you couldn't make this kind of stuff up, and I just find it fabulous that I'm right here in this place with so much of the history around it, including living history, because I got to interview some of the old guys when I first got here who'd been in the resistance, and this was a really crucial point of the French resistance, because just south of here was a German armored division, an SS Panzer division, twice the size of an ordinary armored division. It was the strongest single military unit in the whole of Western Europe. It had been brought back to be refitted and re-equipped after the Eastern Front. And in normal times, that would have got to the Normandy beaches for D-Day within about 3 days. And the orders came to the resistance from London: whatever it costs, slow these bastards down.
Yeah.
And it took that division 3 weeks to get to the Normandy beaches. If it had got there earlier, who knows what an impact that huge armored fist would have had. And every single extra day was bought with French lives. One of them was a place called Oradour-sur-Glane, where the Germans locked about 600 women and children into a church and set fire to it. It's an epic story, the resistance around here, and I was honored to get to know some of these guys who'd been part of it.
Wow. I did, you mentioned, it's almost like the spirit of the region, and that spirit's been there since prehistoric times. And one thing that I did in the acknowledgements in the back of the book, where you talk about the region and those cultural celebrations, especially around the language, the local language, and being a linguist, I found that just, again, the notion of resistance and not letting language die, and language being linked to identity.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing about the Périgord is it's much older, this region. The French term for it is the Périgord. The Dordogne was a new name dreamed up at the time of the French Revolution, when they wanted to get rid of all of the old feudal connections about the provinces. But the Périgord is much, much older than France. The first time we hear of the name the Périgord is in Julius Caesar's account of his wars against the Gauls. And he talks about the tribes around here, whom he called the Petrocores, which means the hearts of stone. And he said they were some of the finest fighters in the Gaulish army when he fought them at Alesia to defeat Vercingetorix. This sense of a part of France that has a much greater longer history than France does, that had its own language for a long, long time, that was a lot of my old friends still speak Occitan, the original language, which was the mother tongue of Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, by the way, because his mother was Eleanor of Aquitaine. And it's I just find this sort of strength of local custom and tradition and pride really, really important. And it's a very special place. I mean, our prehistoric ancestors set up shop here. I mean, the Vézère Valley, where I now live, it was like the Piccadilly Circus for prehistoric peoples. I mean, we've got caves everywhere here. Most of what we know about prehistory comes from this valley.
From that region. Wow. As we're talking and we're in that context, that geographical context, I'm thinking how I wish, if it's not too presumptuous of me to say, that I were with you now there, and that we were maybe, on the terrace, having a glass of wine. If we were, what would you be serving?
I would be serving my own wine, Cuvée Bruno. And here you have Bruno's Basset Hound, the dog, who's called Balzac, and the dog is wearing a French policeman's helmet, the képi. So it's a very pleasant red wine, and it's traditional Bergerac wine. It's a mixture of Cabernet Sauvignon Merlot,
Mhm.
a bit of Cabernet Franc, and because of Eleanor of Aquitaine, I've put in a bit of Malbec. Now, Malbec, we call it in this area, we call it Cot, and it was the wine that was served at the wedding of Eleanor of Aquitaine in the year 1137. So I felt we have a little bit of that in there.
Do you know, I'm wondering if, because of the length normally of these interviews, I'm wondering if we're going to need a part two, because I could listen to these, to these aren't stories. I mean, these are facts and ideas, and it's wondrous. But if we could, we should turn to Bruno. I mean, and I was very much, as I say, a newcomer to this chief of police, Bruno Corrège. Yeah. Um. Again, for any viewer who hasn't had the chance, could you give us a brief description of who is this man?
Okay, Bruno is an orphan. His mother abandoned him outside a church when he was a few weeks old. He went to a church orphanage until his mother's elder sister, an aunt, tracked him down and took him into her very poor home in the Bergerac, which is like one of the capitals of the Périgord region. And he doesn't do well at school. He joins the French army as a youth volunteer at the age of 17. Spends 10 years in the French army as a combat engineer, and finishes in the Bosnian peacekeeping operation, where he gets shot. And he also wins a Croix de Guerre for helping pull some guys out of a burning armored car at in the shelling of the Sarajevo airport. And then he spends some time in hospital. He comes out. He's invalided out of the military. He decides his old commander has a relative who is a mayor in the Périgord, and says, I know they'll be looking next year for a new local policeman. Why don't you go and do a course at the police academy? Which Bruno does. He becomes the town policeman of this little town of Saint-Denis, which is modeled upon the place pretty much where I live.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a town with its own, with a famous historic market that founded in the year 1319. It's got a lovely old stone bridge that was built by Napoleon. It used to have an old convent that was burned down in the French Revolution. It's a market town of about 2,000 people in the middle of a mainly agricultural commune, and it's the heartland of some of the great French delicacies like black truffles and
Mm.
like foie gras, and makes very, very good wine. And it's also a kind of becoming increasingly a tourist center simply because of the popularity of the Dordogne. A lot of gîtes, a lot of campsites, and so Bruno is a guy who prefers never to arrest anybody if he possibly can. He believes in his job is to prevent crime rather than to punish it.
Mm-hmm.
He spends all of his time, as does the model, as does the original policeman, all of his spare time teaching the local kids to play rugby in the winter
Mm-hmm.
and tennis in the summer. And one lovely story on this is that we have a girls' rugby team. Rugby is a religion here, and I've become the godfather of this girls' rugby team. And I've always had my eye upon a brilliant little player we had, a young woman, who I saw when we were winning the local regional championship. And I always thought she would play for France someday. And in one of my novels, I have one of these girls actually gets to play for France.
Yes.
And this year she's played for France. She played for France in the team that won the European Championship.
Wow.
And going to be going on to play in the Olympics in the 7-a-sides. So that's we're very, very proud of her. So it's a lovely little area. It's a very pleasant little town. The mayor, I've had 4 mayors since I've been here, but the first 2 I sort of combined together into this wise old owl of a figure. Then I brought in more and more people. So there is there is the mad Englishwoman, as she's called. In fact, she's a Scot, who Bruno gets to know when she is riding her horses all the time. Then she starts a riding school. And when he's on the rebound from his great love affair with a French policewoman called Isabelle, who has moved to Paris to further her career, on the rebound, he links up with Pamela. And it's a very affectionate relationship. And the more and more people get brought into this sort of group of characters. So there is a man called Gilles, who was a reporter in Sarajevo for the French newspaper Libération. And now here he is back in Saint-Denis because he's fallen in love with Fabiola, the local doctor. And they are now an item. And then there is another guy called the Baron, who is based upon my neighbor in my tiny little part of the village, who really was the local Baron. And he was instrumental in getting me to come down and play tennis with him at the tennis club and to meet the guy who became Bruno and so on. Then there is another guy, an old retired captain of gendarmes called Raymond, who is my neighbor. And we often share a little apéro together of an evening. And Raymond is really the model for a guy called JJ or Jean-Jacques, who is the chief detective of the department. And so we have this sort of group of people, including after about the fifth or sixth novel, in came an English guy called Jack Crimson, who was a former British diplomat and a senior intelligence official. So he is there as well. And so we get little bits of espionage coming in, as indeed they do in this book, The Coldest Case, which begins with a real story that I got from Raymond. Because Raymond had this exact case of a body found in the woods, buried in the woods, and nobody could identify it. And Raymond actually does what I said JJ does in the book, to try and identify from the skull what kind of murder or killing it could have been. The reason I had this idea for the story is whenever I'm sitting having a drink with Raymond, on the wall is a photograph of the person he called Oscar, this skull. And it stared at me for so long, I thought, well, there's got to be a story here. Anyway, then we had a couple of years ago, we had a special exhibition at the local Museum of Prehistory just down the road, which was a woman called Elizabeth Dayness. You might have seen the cover of National Geographic when there was a big fuss about recreating the skull of Tutankhamun. And this French woman had rebuilt the skull from built up face muscles and so on. Well, she's done a lot of that with the prehistoric skulls around here, with the Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon. And I went to this exposition that displayed all this, and I thought, now, if we could get her to work on Oscar, this skull of Raymond's, maybe we could get a face. And all of a sudden, I had a novel.
So, fact, real life,
yeah,
informing this story. And it's, you mentioned JJ,
yeah,
Bruno's boss, and it's JJ's cold case, isn't it? It's JJ couldn't solve this case, and I wondered why. I wondered about the dynamic between Bruno and his boss, because Bruno then is the impetus behind revisiting.
This is one of the interesting things about the French police system. JJ is not Bruno's boss. JJ is the chief detective for the Police Nationale. And the Police Nationale are run by the Ministry of Justice. The gendarmes, they report to the Ministry of War because they're a paramilitary body. Bruno's boss is the mayor of his village because he is appointed by the mayor and the council. He's a municipal policeman. So we've got the Police Nationale, we've got the municipal police, and we've got the gendarmes. So in Paris, for example, it's the municipal police, it's the Préfecture de Police de Paris, which actually runs the Parisian police service. So Maigret was working for yet another arm of the French police, if you like. And that part of that complexity of France is it's meat and drink to a writer, because you can have all of these relationships which are complex but also can be mutually reinforcing. And
Mm.
so Bruno, he doesn't have to report to Jean-Jacques. They are friends and allies.
Ah, and that makes sense then in the idea of, I don't know, wanting to help a colleague, wanting to help a friend with
Yeah.
something that just, that nags away at Jean-Jacques. So I like that collaboration there. Um, you mentioned that the setting Saint Denis is it's a fictional town, but it bears strong resemblance. I wonder if your friends there and the townspeople, their reaction to this amazing crime series focusing on their area. What reaction do you get from local people?
Well, at first, before they began to come out in French, every time a new book came out, I would have a dinner party for Pierrot and his wife, and the mayor and his wife, and Raymond and the Baron. And I would say, well, after the first course, I'd tap the glass and say, well, dear friends, we're celebrating the publication of a new novel about Bruno, in which I write about the beauty of the women of the Perigord and the intelligence of the men of the Perigord. And they all say, oui, 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 Martin, oui, mais c'est bien. More wine, more wine. And off, then I was a bit nervous when
Mm,
the first one came out in French. And I sort of wondered how I'd get run out of town on a rail or something. But no, they all seem very, very happy with it, particularly because of the tourism it's brought.
mhm,
And indeed, Pierrot, the policeman, he's now like a tourist icon because in summer on market day, we'll get, Germans,
mhm.
Dutch, Japanese, Turks coming in, and they're looking around the market for a guy in police uniform. And they will go up and say, "Êtes-vous Bruno?" And and Bruno will say proudly, "Jawohl," or "Oui," or "Yes." And he will sign books. He will stand for
Wow.
selfies with the wife and so on. He loves it. And so, um, anyway, I've become sort of adopted in a way. They've made me
Mm.
ambassador of the Perigord. I'm a grand consul of the wines of the region, and I got a gold medal from the French government for services to tourism.
I, I, and listening to your experiences and your life and thinking how things have changed. When we began our discussion, you mentioned about being in Washington
Yeah.
and about to go into the Oval Office, and here we are now. You have become, such an important part of the region that you now live in. I'm just fascinated by what life can do and where it can take us.
Well, uh, you never plan these things.
Mm,
But when I was a little boy, my mum would always say to me, Martin, life is short, the world is big, go out and see as much of it as you can. And she said, never get stuck in a rut. And one of the great things about being a foreign correspondent was that I lived in so many different parts of the world, worked in different parts of the world. And here I am with an entirely new kind of life and setting and career. And it's never too late. And it's always interesting to do something different. I mean, life is short. So
yeah,
pack in what you can.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you. I think I needed to hear that message today as well. That's wonderful. At the front of the book, there's a dedication to Les Pompiers,
Yeah.
and if my French serves me right from many years ago, it's to do with the fire brigade.
Yes.
Is it not? What do they mean to you? Why that dedication?
Well, they're a really important part of French village life. We have a fire station here with three big fire trucks. We are responsible for the area for about 20 kilometers all around. The firemen are not just for the fires; they are the ambulance service.
Mhm.
They are the emergency medical service. When my mother had a heart attack here, it was the pompier who came and worked on her. So they're volunteers. There are only two full-time firemen.
Whoa.
The rest are all local people, volunteers.
Mhm.
And so when you hear the big like World War II siren, that's the call for the emergency firemen. We have a forest fire at one point, and there is Bruno with the pompier, and in a quite unusual form of firefighting that they develop here. Well, you may recall from the book.
With the sax, is that correct? Yeah.
That's
Yeah. 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 Um, I, I just wondered as well about the position of, I mean, I'm talking in reality now, I suppose, but
mhm.
the position, the reaction of the local population to to the police or the various police forces. Is it is it a good relationship that there is in the region?
It always depends upon the individual who is the village cop.
Mhm.
That's key to everything. There is the gendarme. Traditionally, they've always lived in barracks around their gendarmerie. They're meant to be separate from the local people. As I say, they are a paramilitary force. And I mean, they were set up in 1793 to help put down the anti-revolutionaries in Brittany and elsewhere. Um, so there's always a level of suspicion about the gendarmes, particularly these days, since they enforce the traffic regulations,
Mm.
drink driving laws. And then the police nationale, which tend to be much more like the FBI, if you like. But the French have got a love-hate relationship with government and with authority. I mean, they like to think of themselves as natural revolutionaries and rebels and so on. Uh, but certainly, they're all intense individualists. So it's a tricky series of relationships, which means that individuals who are in a job like Bruno's can, in fact, develop very, very good relationships with
Mm.
everybody. Because, I mean, all of the kids have grown up knowing him because he's teaching them to play rugby and tennis.
Yeah, yeah.
All of the young mothers, he's danced at their weddings. He's helped carry the coffin of their grandfathers at their funerals. I mean, he knows everybody. He's probably had a drink in every single house in the commune.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
this is just so important. This is policing, not just by consent, but by somebody you trust.
Yeah, that again, that sense of community that's
Exactly.
there, that this isn't an outsider, but this
Yeah.
is somebody that's one of us and that cares about us, and it matters
Yeah.
definitely. Now, speaking of caring about things, I'm going to ask you a bit of a difficult question, I think. Um, 14 books in the series. Now, if books are like children, one shouldn't have a favorite.
True.
That I understand. But book 14 and the Dordogne Mysteries, what are you most proud of about this book?
About this particular book,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm proud of bringing in towards the end something of the local Middle Ages history, the Hundred Years' War, the castles, and so on. Because don't forget, the English were here for 300 years. From the 1152 when Eleanor marries the future King Henry II until 1453 when we're finally driven out. Um, so I've always wanted to bring in more and more of that Middle Ages aspect. I did it in an earlier book about a castle which has links to the Templars and so on. But also, I was really pleased for Raymond's sake to bring in this idea of Oscar, the case he could never solve, this disappeared skull, or this unidentified skull, and finally crack that case. But equally, there was something else. I mean, I one of the most interesting times of my life was the 4 years we spent in Moscow,
Mm.
with in the during Gorbachev's time,
Hmm.
Perestroika and so on, when the place was just lifting with change. It was a wonderful time to be there, and I've been interested in that ever since. One of the books I wrote was a history of the Cold War, and I've also became very interested in East Germany and what a strange kind of place that was. And I had always kept in the back of my mind a knowledge about something which is a bit of a legend among people in the intelligence world. It's called the Rosenholz dossier, and it's the master file of all of the agents of the Stasi, the East German intelligence service. And somehow, by hook or by crook, and there are various accounts of this, the Americans, the CIA, got hold of a copy in those tumultuous days after the Berlin Wall came down. Some say they bought it for a song. Others say they traded it for protection for some of the Stasi officials. We don't know. What we do know is that the Americans selectively shared this dossier with their allies. So the Brits were given all of the copies of all of the files pertaining to British people who had Stasi contacts. And it turns out most of them were perfectly harmless members of CND or Ban the Bomb or whatever. The Swedes, the Norwegians, the Finns, others were all given their bits, the Germans, not the French. There's been a long history of tension between French and US intelligence going back to the days of Charles de Gaulle. In fact, I even tell the story in the novel about one French intelligence official who was the head of French intelligence in the USA, who actually applied for and got sanctuary in the USA because he thought, if I go home, they're going to kill me. They think I've turned American. So, so the French don't have access to this Rosenholz dossier. And this becomes a key part of the plot of this novel as they try and find out who was this unidentified skull, how was he killed, why was he killed, and what's this got to do with the Rosenholz dossier, is one of the best kept secrets of the Cold War. Ta-da!
Martin, you bring us to the most perfect. I don't want to end our conversation. I really don't. But sadly, I must. But you bring it to a perfect end. Viewers, go get a hold of this book. I mean, if you've not read Martin before, well, read the other books beforehand. But of course, if you have, you'll know that book 14 is just going to be an absolute treat. I want to thank you so much, Martin, for taking time to be with us on The Doctor Will See You Now. I hope this won't be the only time that you come to the consultation room. But
I'm feeling a bit poorly, Doctor.
The Doctor will have you back. No, I wish you all the very best with the Dordogne, the Dordogne mysteries, the coldest case, and I look forward to seeing you, shall we say, in real life when we can.
I look forward to it. I'll keep a bottle for you.
Please do. That would be glorious.
Thank you very much for having me.
All the very best. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Oh, I'm sorry we had to stop it. And I really mean it. If at all possible, I would love to be able to, I would love to be able to invite you to Newcastle Noir to the festival, if that's ever possible. And if not, I would love to visit you and do more, more interview.
Okay.
Beautiful.
Open invitation. Look forward to seeing you. Thank you very much indeed.
All the very best with the book. Yeah.
See you. Bye-bye.